Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dean Glass, and I thank you for joining us as we celebrate National Preservation Month with a program that speaks directly to the future of San Diego's neighborhoods. We are honored to present Donovan Rypkema, principal of Place Economics and one of the nation's foremost voices on the economics of historic preservation. He has advised cities, states, and organizations across the country and internationally, and is widely recognized for his ability to translate complex economic data into clear, actionable insights for policymakers and community leaders alike. Today, he will share his findings of SOHO's newly released Economic Impact Report, San Diego Historic Preservation, a Vitality Report. Drawing on both local data and national perspective, his presentation reveals compelling and in some cases surprising insights. Following Donovan's presentation, we will have time for questions. We invite you to submit your questions at any point during the program using the Zoom chat, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible at the end of the program. And now please join me in welcoming Donovan Rypkema.
Thanks very much. I'll see if I can figure out how to share. Is that working?
Yes, it sure is.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I checked the weather in San Diego, and it was such that I thought, why in the world would anybody sit through a stupid webinar with this kind of weather? But then your weather like that is always like that in San Diego, so I guess I'm not surprised. We are just really appreciative of the having had the opportunity to do this study for SOHO. And I know you all know this, but SOHO is just one of the great local preservation organizations in the country, and the success of that, I think, by any measure of historic preservation in San Diego, at least part of that credit for that can be given to SOHO. So what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through the study that we did, and again, as you were told, we'll have plenty of time for questions when we're done. So we negotiated a scope of what would be included in the study, and here it is that we had analyzed the housing market for affordability, including characteristics of older housing, affordability measurements, and analysis of the Mills Act, some social justice measures, including equitable home ownership, displacement, and purchasing power, and then environmental impacts. So that was what the scope was. I'm having trouble advancing here. But here's what you'll hear today, and here's what the scope ended up be. This issue about historic districts as vital places, demographics in historic districts, housing development in historic districts, older housing and affordability. And again, we talked early on to Alana about including older housing, whether or not it's designated historic and whether or not it merits being designated historic, just what the role that older housing does to meet affordability needs, some about the Mills Act, and then the environmental impact of adaptive reuse. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Somehow. So the first, starting out with historic districts as vital places. So here's a map and then a blown up map of historic districts in San Diego. It's 27 historic districts. When we drew on census data, so the demographic information, income information, so forth, we used 16 of those. And the reason, it's not like we chopped somebody out just not to include their data. The reason that some districts were not included is either they were totally commercial, and so there were no demographics, or in many cases, they were simply too small to have reliable data. You can't get census data on one city block, and so in a historic district, just 2 or 3 buildings on a block simply wasn't enough to have reliable data. So we learned the demographic things from 16 districts, and some measure then included them all. And here's the first one. I know that the last year or so, there's been a critique of preservation in San Diego. And some of the argument goes, well, we need density. We're a growing city, and we're going to have efficient Public services, we're going to have density, and those stupid historic districts, they're keeping us from having density. Well, in fact, the opposite of that is true, that we looked at the density in historic districts and compared that with the density in the rest of the residentially zoned areas. Well, it is historic districts that are providing density in San Diego, density rate per square mile at twice that of the rest of San Diego. So the idea is keeping density from happening is just patently untrue. So why is that? Why is that? Well, it's a couple of reasons. One is that the footprint of the houses are smaller. They're on average in historic districts about 500 square feet smaller per single family house than the rest of San Diego. But it also is driven in part by the nature of the housing unit mix in historic districts. What's true in historic districts is that there's a lower portion of single family dwellings, both detached and attached, a larger portion of multifamily. But I think importantly is that this in disproportionate advantage in historic districts is multifamily at a real neighborhood scale. Those 2, 3, 4 unit apartment houses that really fit in well to a neighborhood, and there's a decidedly greater share in historic districts. And those two things combined, accompanied by a smaller lot size, in fact, is what gives this density in historic district. Now, again, critics of preservation in San Diego say, well, we're growing. We can't have those historic districts keeping growth from happening. Well, in fact, San Diego is growing. Over the last decade, it grew about 4%. The population in historic districts grew at a rate twice that amount. Now, you can't have neighborhoods being frozen in amber, anti-development, anti-growth, when in fact the growth is happening at a greater rate, at twice the rate in the historic districts than in the rest of the city. In fact, while historic districts are home to a little less than 2% of the population, and by the way, about 1% of the land area in San Diego is in historic districts, there's that 2% of the population, but they accounted for 4% of the population growth. So where is population growth taking place in San Diego? Disproportionately in this little share of the city that's in historic districts. Now, what about housing costs? You know, we're a quantitative research firm, and we're pleased with that. But often, what we see a role is kind of myth breakers, because there's often the caricatures about historic districts, and nationally and in San Diego as well, saying, well, those historic districts might be nice, but that's what rich people live. Well, true in some places, not true in San Diego. Well, there's some very wealthy, wonderful neighborhoods that happen to be historic districts. In fact, the average home value is less in historic districts than the rest of the city. That the gross rents are less, about $145 a month less in historic districts than the rest of the city. So in fact, they are a more affordable place than the city as a whole. So you have this situation where you have median household income, in fact, at $12,000 or so per household less in historic districts. And you have these smaller areas. But when we look at the buying power, the spending power of those neighborhoods, it's over twice as much as per acre as the rest of the area. It is this concentration of buying power in smaller areas. And it's not an accident that many, if not most, of your really wonderful neighborhood commercial districts are next door or part of a local historic district. That's where the buying power is. $1.2 billion of household expenditures are made every year from the historic district, people living in historic districts in San Diego. And then what about the demographics? We always think that a snapshot is useful, but you really know the story by looking at the movie. So I want to share both the snapshot and how the change is taking place. So who lives in a historic district? Well, it is distinctly more white than the city as a whole. But the other elements, most of the elements, Hispanic, Black, are not dissimilar from the city as a whole. The big difference is Asian population. the Asian population decidedly less in historic districts. So it gives this appearance of a skew to the white population, where in fact, where the skew is a much less Asian population in the historic districts. Were the same rate of Asian population in historic districts as the rest of the city. In fact, the white portion would be about the same as the city as a whole as well. And that's our kind of basic approach when we do this analysis. We say, what's true in the historic district, and how does that differ or be the same as what the rest of the city looks like? Now, in terms of household income distribution, at the lower end of the economic spectrum, slightly more in the historic district, greater share in the historic district. Where there's a big difference is at the other end, significantly lower, less of the highest income households. But what it really means is in San Diego, and this is not true every place, in San Diego, that the historic districts are really home to middle income households. Now, there's some at both ends, but that's where this disproportionate share of households in historic districts are middle income households. And then really interesting thing, of course, you all know San Diego well. While I've been there a dozen times, I didn't have this nuanced understanding. When we first looked at what the Census Bureau calls tenure, and that what it really means is owners versus renters, there was this disproportionate share of renters in historic districts, about more than 70% renters, where city as a whole, San Diego as a whole, is just about 50-50 renters to owners, a little bit a greater share of renters. But when we visited every historic district in San Diego and started asking more questions, well, what skews those numbers is the Ocean Beach area. That there's such a large number of housing units, most of which are rentals. So if you take those out of the Ocean Beach area, then that spread between owners and renters gets much more like the city as a whole. Now, again, the racial distribution of homeowners who owns in historic districts, again, it looks at first blush, well, there's kind of a disproportionate skew to white population, and there is, but it's not because there's far fewer Black or Hispanic. It's fewer because of the much smaller Asian population in historic districts. But importantly, again, this is the movie as opposed to the snapshot. How are the demographics changing over time? Well, what we see is the change in non-white population and in Hispanic population grew at a much greater rate in historic districts than they did in the rest of San Diego. The change in the number of Hispanic homeowners changed dramatically greater rate in historic districts than the rest of the city. And the number of non-white homeowners, again, significantly greater in historic districts. So while there's a skew in the current demographics, in fact, the change is in the direction of diversity. And in fact, you have some extraordinarily diverse historic neighborhoods. Island Air, where you have this almost a quarter of each demographic character. So one of the great diverse neighborhoods in the country, let alone in San Diego. And in Sherman Heights, for example, 53% of all the homeowners in Sherman Heights, in fact, are Hispanic. So the next element in the study was housing development in historic districts. And again, I know that there's lots of political discussion. We have to have more housing units, and the historic districts are keeping us from having that out and out lie. So here's what's happened in historic districts. Not only has the population grown at a disproportionate share relative to the rest of the city, but so have the housing units. In between 2013 and 2023, the last dates that data is available, there was about an 8% growth in housing units in the rest of San Diego. There was a 13% growth in housing units in historic districts. Again, it just makes nonsense of this idea that somehow historic districts keep stuff from happening. Lots is happening. In fact, more is happening proportionately in historic districts, both in population growth and in housing growth than in the rest of San Diego. And then ADUs. Now, of course, what we learned in ADUs, and we as a firm have become fans of ADUs, but the San Diego approach is ADUs on steroids, far beyond what was ever imagined being. But we looked at ADUs in historic districts, and what we found is, in fact, there's almost twice the rate of ADUs per square mile in historic districts than in the rest of San Diego. The idea that historic districts aren't carrying their share of the load in terms of ADUs, again, not true. Not true. In fact, more than the share is being carried by historic district. Again, about 1.8% of all residential properties are in historic district, but 2.6% of the ADUs have been built in historic districts. So historic districts are more than doing their share in terms of accommodating ADUs for additional housing. Then this issue about kind of how does it compare overall? Well, the patterns in terms of the ADUs per parcel and the income levels of people in the amount of moderate income or below is about the same in the historic districts as the rest of the city. So they're doing more in the historic district with the same kind of outcomes in terms of kind of who's living there and the intensity of development. And then I'm not so sure that this isn't the most important component of the study overall, and that's the issue of older housing and affordability. And I need to step back and explain to you what we mean. So older housing, we defined older housing as that built prior to 1970. So it's more than met that kind of 50-year threshold where we begin to look is it merits being designated historic. And then we looked at the concentration. Again, we can't go house by house. So we look at where there's concentration of older housing. And we looked for census blocks where 50% of or more of the housing was built prior to 1970. And you can see on the map, the darker the shade, the greater the share of those that were this concentration of older housing. So those are the areas we looked at for the patterns, the contribution of older housing to affordability. So here's data that's statewide, and I put it here because it's not available at the San Diego level. But as housing gets newer, it gets more expensive, period. Now, I don't care. You can't build yourself out of the affordable housing need. Cannot be done. The number one priority strategy has to be keeping what we have in place. And again, you've all heard the acronym NOAH, Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing. That comes from older housing. There is no such thing as a new NOAH. If you're going to have NOAH, it's going to have to come from existing housing. And look at this. There's a kind of flat rate of what the monthly housing, median housing cost is until you get to the 1980s, and then it goes up a couple $100 a month every decade. So if you're going to have affordable housing, it's coming from that housing 50 years old and older. And then this issue about housing values and housing costs. So the average home value in these, again, this is older neighborhoods versus the rest of San Diego, 610,000 versus 724, so $100,000 cheaper, lower property value. And the monthly housing costs, again, not huge amounts, but a little less in those areas as well. So who lives there? Well, in fact, who lives in the older neighborhoods is not dissimilar in terms of race and income that the city as a whole. Slightly lower share at the upper end, but you can see the numbers are pretty straight across the board. Median household income a little less in the areas. The racial distribution, again, starts to even up, starts to look more like the city as a whole. So when you look at older housing who lives there, it's not dissimilar in race and in income than it is in San Diego as a city. But, and importantly, there's a measurably higher rates of home ownership in these older districts, and that goes across the demographic barrier. white, black, Hispanic, Asian, other, all have a greater rate of home ownership in older neighborhoods than in newer neighborhoods. In fact, you can see that in older neighborhoods, the ownership share is 54%, and where the rest of the city of San Diego is 44%. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody should be a homeowner. It's certainly not the case. But if we say that that's a kind of a pillar of stability and an aspirational, in fact, it happens more likely to happen in older neighborhoods than newer ones. And this is really another, to me, interesting one. We looked at how long people had lived there. And among owners, about 38% had been there for 25 years or more, as compared to about 28% in the newer neighborhoods. And even among renters, and the kind of caricature of renters as well, they're a rapid turnover, they don't stay long. Well, 5% of renters in older neighborhoods have been there for 25 years or more, a rate almost twice of the rest of the city. Vacancy rate lower. Of course, when you have more affordable housing, more people doing it, you're going to have lower vacancy. And then the share of the units by gross rent. What happens is you have 50% of the housing in the older neighborhoods. They're affordable by people at 80% of the median household income and lower. Significantly higher share than in the rest of the city. And at the upper end, the really expensive housing, that's where it's taking place, again, is in the newer neighborhoods. So this issue of older housing, I want to come back to the issue in a minute on a unique part of San Diego's preservation approach. So you have, just like we saw in the historic districts, likewise in the older neighborhoods, we have higher density, you have greater density. It's just both the smaller, it's the smaller footprint of housing. And here, instead of looking, we kind of like to look at things in different ways. Instead of looking at the density by population, we looked at in terms of housing units. Well, there's half again as many housing units per square mile in the older areas than there is in the newer. So before I leave this, you all know that San Diego's preservation ordinance says that housing 45 years or older is subject to review. If it's demolition proposed, to see if in fact it has historic character. And I know that that's a component of the ordinance that come under some criticism. After seeing this data, I think not only does it belong there, and again, we weren't hired to give policy advice, but I'm telling you what I think. Not only does it belong there for historic character, maybe it ought to be expanded to include affordability. Because if San Diego is saying, we have a housing crisis, we have to get more affordable housing, well, for God's sake, then got to keep what you have. And that 45 years, a good threshold, just to add that as an element, saying, okay, it has or does not have historic character, but does it have affordability character as a reason to say, we don't want to be throwing that away. And then, of course, the great California incentive for historic preservation, the Mills Act. And we looked at the use of the Mills Act in the city as a whole. So here's about 1,900 properties have utilized the Mills Act. Interestingly enough, about 60% of them were not in historic districts. I don't mean that that's either good or bad, but it is what it is. And again, we can't look at the income at a single house. The data isn't and shouldn't be available at that data. So what we did is we looked at census blocks where there was a concentration of Mills Act projects. And you can see, so those that had 51 and more in the local census areas is what we called our Mills Act study area. So who uses it? Well, again, it is at first look saying this is more white people using it than others, and that's true. But again, it's not because there are significantly fewer Hispanic or Black. It's because it is significantly lower in Asian use of it, because they're not living where it's available. And the median income, again, sometimes the Mills Act is criticized statewide in California, if not in San Diego, saying, yeah, this is just helping people, rich people with expensive housing to save on their taxes. Well, in fact, the median household income in those areas, those Mills Act study areas where there's been a concentration of activity, a median household income about $10,000 less than in the rest of San Diego. And then the environmental impacts of, again, right on the left, everybody in San Diego says we ought to be caring about the environment. I'm glad you all have that as important. But here's what's missing in the equation is the contribution of not tearing stuff down to the environment. So here's the Granger building. You all know it, wonderful building. Last year, the year before, went through its second historic rehabilitation project using the federal tax credits, and it was saved. It's a use. It's a wonderful project. But what if instead of being saved, it was torn down? The embodied energy that would have been thrown away by the destruction of that building, equivalent to 191,000 gallons of gasoline, 4.3 million miles of automobile driving, all the electric, the 350 houses used for a year, 13 million smartphone charges is what would have meant had that building been torn down instead of rehabilitated. But here's one that was torn down. Now, I don't know what size the little red bungalow was, probably 1,700 square feet, but so I could do the numbers. I just said, let's say that it was 2,000 square feet. What is that? Demolition of a small house is not grand monument, small house. What does that mean in terms of the environment? Well, tearing that down meant almost 300 cubic yards, 84 tons of crap that went someplace, a lot of it to the landfill. 900 million BTUs of embodied energy were thrown away by throwing away that house. And that's equivalent to 7,800 gallons of gasoline. The demolition of that one small house wiped out the entire environmental benefit of the last 3.9 million aluminum cans we recycled. You know, we all recycle our aluminum cans. We're told it's good for the environment. We all do it. On average, San Diegans recycle about the 7,800 San Diegans would recycle about 3.9 million cans a year. So we're doing a good job. Wipes out that benefit, tearing down this one little house. And then, of course, a few years ago, California passed a law that basically got rid of plastic bags. That's fine. But that house being demolished wiped out what would have been all of the bags that weren't used by 6,500 San Diegans. So we say we're really proud of ourselves as environmentalists. We're recycling our aluminum cans. We're not using plastic bags, and yet you're throwing away homes that wipe out huge amounts of the benefit of those other things. So I put the presentation together and decided what I wanted to talk about. But then I thought I just want to experiment with this. So I took the entire report, loaded it up, and had AI look at it and say, what did we learn? What did we learn from this report? And here's what AI tells us. That here's the myths, that historic districts are anti-growth, that it's stifling housing development, that it's stagnant, they're museum-like, they're encased in amber, and that they're exclusively wealthy. That's the kind of conventional wisdom, the mythology about historic districts. Again, this isn't me talking, this is AI looking at the data from the report. In fact, San Diego's Historic Preservation Framework is a blueprint for urban vitality. The data reveals that these neighborhoods are denser, more affordable, significantly growing faster than the rest of the city. And then the perception versus the reality. Perception on growth, that it's stagnant. In fact, it's growing twice as fast as the rest of the city. That's low density. It has twice as many residents per square mile as the rest of the city. That's enclaves of the elite. In fact, it's lower than the median income of the rest of the city. Somehow it's anti-ADU. No, it's carrying more than its share. And then, although the baseline is lower, in fact, these measurements of growth in diversity is being accomplished more in historic districts than it is in the rest of San Diego. And then this issue about ADUs in particular, 1.8% of the land area, but 2.6% of the ADUs are in that area. And again, when we make the comparison between the older housing, and again, I think this is really a critical part of the report. What's true about the older housing, which is providing the lowest, the rent is cheaper, the average single family house is more affordable, that there's people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum are more likely to be able to afford in that area than in the other area, and there's more housing units per square mile. So these contributions that older housing is significant across the board. And then there's issues about diversity, a greater rate of growth in Black home ownership, greater rate of growth of Hispanic ownership in these older neighborhoods. And then the Mills Act, here's how AI described it. Yeah, get a tax relief. It enables private investment. It preserves the character of the house and thereby the neighborhood. In fact, it empowers modest income residents. That's what the Mills Act does in San Diego. And then again, some comparisons on what happened with the Granger building versus what if that had been a building that size had been built out of new construction. And then the demolition numbers that I gave you, that little house torn down, it's wiped out the benefit of 3.8 million aluminum cans or 2,600 plastic bags that were used. So the conclusion, the AI conclusion about what historic districts are doing, it's density, it's affordability, it's equity. Those are the things that City Hall says that they want for San Diego, and that in fact is what the historic districts are doing. So with that, I'll shut up, and I'm just happy to take questions, comments, alternative views, or stay back in Washington, you idiot, whatever. So thanks very much.
Hi, thank you, Donovan. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window. I have some questions here. The report shows that historic districts are producing more ADUs per square mile. What does that tell us about how these neighborhoods are evolving?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think that we're objective about it, that ADUs are a way to provide more housing affordability. It rarely is cheap housing, but at least it adds housing units for more people. And the advantage of having ADUs, and it's one of the reasons, frankly, that we as a firm have kind of become fans of ADUs, it allows that addition in the neighborhood. It adds the density to the neighborhood, but because it's within historic districts, it's subject to design review. So it's being added so that it is not diminishing the quality and the character of the neighborhood. In fact, it's designed to enhance it. And the way that most ADUs are designed, and that is at the kind of back of the lot, it means if it's at the right scale, which it will be in a historic district, that it can add to the neighborhood, and the historic neighborhoods are carrying their weight.
Okay. Can you explain the role that older, smaller homes play as naturally occurring housing in San Diego, affordable housing in San Diego?
Well, it's this. I think it's one of those places where both the data and the marketplace is speaking. If you look at, there's a decided difference in terms of the income levels that live in older housing as in new. That the size. See, you know, here's another weird thing that the building industry kind of forgets. I don't know what the numbers are in San Diego, but half or a little more than half of all households in America are 1 or 2 person households. Well, the building industry is building, when they're building single family homes, they're building it for, like, it's Leave It to Beaver, and there's a mom who stays home and work, and dad goes to work, and 2 kids. Well, that's not the family anymore. And what what those older housing units, they're smaller, and some people say, well, they're too small to be good in the market, competitive in the marketplace. No, they aren't. For a whole bunch of families, that's exactly the kind of unit. And so it provides this density, it provides affordability, it provides a scale, all those things that are part of the housing affordability equation is in fact what those older housing units, those NOAHs, are doing. Again, we have a standard line in our firm, PlaceEconomics, and that is you can't build new and rent or sell cheap. It can't be done. It can't be done. It can't be done unless you have gargantuan subsidies. So what you're doing with this NOAH, those aren't subsidized housing units. They're just there. They're affordable because they're in existence. And when we tear them down, they're no longer existent, almost by definition. You tear down a house 50 years old and older, you're tearing down a unit of affordable housing, period. Period.
What outcomes are translatable to other parts of the country?
Well, I think that I think this pattern of older housing is transferable, and we've looked at it in other places. I think it's many times, honestly, that the income levels in historic districts in the aggregate will, while most places will have historic districts that are both quite wealthy and quite not wealthy, this composite, this aggregate difference, where in fact the historic districts are both in lower property values, lower home, more affordable homes, and slightly less household income. I think that's unusual. We haven't found that in other places. I think that the success of preservation in San Diego over the last 35 years is also something that can be learned from other places. Again, San Diego is not the only kind of 20th century city we've looked at. We did a study like this in LA and one in Phoenix and one in Dallas. But this approach to preservation in San Diego, I think, is unique, and it's resulted in high quality character historic neighborhoods.
Did your study and analysis look at property taxes and in historic districts?
We didn't. It'd be an interesting thing, and we didn't.
Okay.
Now, again, that's because of the weird prop, whatever it is, the 3 decades ago or 4 decades ago that warps taxes. And you're probably going to see, my guess is, because you have this in older neighborhoods, and historic neighborhoods, you have this longer tenancy, both of owners and renters. They're there longer. I expect that there's people, it's happening all over, they're just stalling off selling because the property taxes are going to take such a big jump when it's sold. So you're probably going to see decidedly lower rates, but we did not look at that specifically.
All right. I've been thinking about whether there are economically viable models for communities to preserve smaller scale housing and neighborhood character without freezing development entirely. Have you seen examples that work?
Well, I think San Diego is the example that starts citing that works. Now, having said that, if I were the czar and we're looking for policy standards on both the residential and the commercial side, I've become a big fan of community land trusts. To acquire property, hold property. A buyer can come in and buy the property, but they're buying the house, not the land. And when they get ready to sell, there's a cap on the amount. They can make money on the sale, but it's going to be limited, so it stays in the affordability. So I don't know what the situation in terms of land trusts are in San Diego, but we've become a big believer in them, and I think that's going to be a real option. One in the last, I'll give you somebody who did something really smart in the last big real estate crash, and of course Arizona was affected particularly by that. What the city of Phoenix did is they went and bought properties from out of foreclosure from banks and put them in kind of their affordable housing inventory. And I think that's a strategy. And real estate goes up and down. So when there's a low market, that's a good time for an entity like a land trust to go and acquire properties and then put them in the kind of permanently affordable category.
Right, we have two there, similar questions. San Diego doesn't account for demolition and construction waste as part of our climate action plan. Are there cities elsewhere in the U.S. that incorporate carbon cost in demolition as part of historic preservation incentives? And this other person is saying that there is such a program in Austin where contractors have to recycle 25% of the items torn out during demolition.
Yeah, they are similar questions, and I appreciate the comment. What now in terms of kind of counting the carbon footprint of demolition in terms of some kind of local review to meet sustainable development goals? I don't know that any are, but more and more cities are adopting demolition ordinances. A few years ago in San Antonio, the Historic Preservation Office went to the city council and said, we think we ought to have a demolition ordinance, that we don't want to lose historic properties, but sometimes they're lost. And when they're lost, they ought to not just go to the landfill. We ought to require that they be taken apart, that material is reused. And the city council said, yeah, maybe, but we need to know more about it. And so we were hired to look at a deconstruction ordinance in San Antonio. It has become a huge, and then the sent the report, preservation office went back city council adopted it, and it's been a huge success in terms of jobs created by that process, by materials being available for reincorporation into other things. Sometimes it's used for affordable housing, and it's a dramatic reduction in what's going to the landfill. Across the country, between a quarter and a third of everything that goes into the landfill is construction debris. I got to tell you that I don't think, I'll be happy for somebody to prove me wrong, I don't think that there is a landfill in America where the tipping fees pay for the lifetime cost of the landfill. That between the property acquisition, its operation, and then the forever maintenance after you close the thing down, that the costs, and those are nearly always public costs, the public cost of landfills are not covered by what somebody said. Some demolition contractor says, hey, I pay my money every time I go and dump that stuff. That is not covering the cost, meaning that the rest of us are constantly subsidizing demolition. If I were the czar again, I don't know what the demolition fees are, but they ought to be 5 times as much. If we get to a point where demolition is discouraged, that's going to have huge impacts, both in terms of affordability and climate impact, sustainability issues.
Did you look at the age distribution, total population, and age of the households, the age of the people in the households within San Diego's historic districts versus the city as a whole? Would a higher share of retirees in historic districts help explain lower average incomes in historic districts?
We did not, and maybe. My guess is what we probably did, frankly, because we always cast a real wide net. We look at kind of every demographic category, and when they don't show up in the report, is if there was nothing to report, there was no significant difference. Now, I can't guarantee you that we looked at it, but we would usually look at that just to see if there was a pattern difference. Maybe there is. You could be right. We didn't look at that, and so I can't say for sure, but my suspicion is we probably looked at it and didn't include it because there was no story there.
Have you seen any successful models where communities use pooled capital or stewardship structures for preservation purposes?
Not on any large scale, but I'm a big advocate of that. You hear, the people who package, now I'll move off the residential for a minute and think about the tax credit eligible stuff, or it could be rental residential. You hear from the tax credit people, oh, a little $500,000, $1.5 million project, $2 million project, they're just too small and we can't syndicate it and blah, blah, blah. Excuses for can't package a deal to provide tax credits. Well, there is a simple solution. And that is, instead of thinking about it property by property, you think of an investment pool. Maybe it's a $50 million pool. and you buy individual properties through the pool and then get the tax credit and distribution through a pool. I don't know of an example, but it's something that's long overdue, and San Diego could be at the cutting edge of inventing one.
Excuse me. We've had several people asking if somebody will be presenting this report to the city. Uh, uh, and I just want to say it's being recorded, and yes, it likely will be. Um, did you find any enhancement in levels of mixed levels of household incomes in historic districts, or did you just look at overall averages? Seems like mixed income levels are a big advantage for communities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Whoever asked that question, you're absolutely right. And we strongly believe in economic integration, that healthy neighborhoods have a whole slew of income ranges. And what you'll look, so we didn't look at neighborhood by neighborhood, but if you look at in the aggregate, this is not just the medians. In the report, there are the cohorts of income throughout there, and you'll see that there is a wide range of household income levels and groupings in historic districts. And we think that's a very healthy thing. We just think it's fundamentally healthy for a person of a lot of wealth to live next to a person with very little wealth. It's good for both of them. We think that historic neighborhoods provide that, and that's a healthy thing. So again, some of the things, good questions, and sometimes a scope will spell out specific, things to look at. And we've other places done what we call our economic integration metric, that kind of looks at how is that distribution in a historic district parallel to the city. We didn't do that specifically for San Diego, but it's doable.
Are historic districts typically benefiting from good transit options?
Again, we didn't look at that, but yes, yes. And where we've looked at it other places, absolutely, because of the nature of how cities grew. And again, you look at the map, the San Diego map of where the historic districts are, they're clustered toward the core, and that will tend to be where the transit is better, or more accessible or closer. And so in lots of studies, we have looked at that, and absolutely, and it's one of the attributes of the neighborhoods. We think that to some extent, that people choosing, particularly younger people, choosing to be in historic districts are really driven by the three C's: by the character, by the cost, and by the convenience. And that convenience might be closer to the center city, it might be closer to transportation, closer to public services, closer to schools, whatever. But those kind of three C's are a real driver for historic districts. It's not just gargoyles and whatever.
Do you have any advice about how to get politicians, developers, and lead lenders to accept and work with the compelling results of this landmark study?
Well, yeah, thank God I don't have to do that. I'm totally incompetent. But here's what I think you need to do, is that bankers and developers and politicians and others say, here's my set of priorities. Here's what I want to happen. Well, I haven't heard of anybody's list in San Diego, whether it's talking about affordability, about talking about growth, talking about equity, talking about diversity, talking about density. Those are the kind of things that are on, particularly on politicians. Oh, here's my campaign. I'm going to be for density, diversity, affordability. Well, that's what you're doing. You can't be saying that that's what your objectives are and not say, geez, these historic districts you're advancing the objectives that I'm trying to do.
One of our viewers says, we live in a 1913 prairie home under the Mills Act. We are retired on a fixed income. If San Diego were to remove the Mills Act tax credit, we would not be able to afford the maintenance. Thus, the house would go into disrepair. What is your opinion on this effect?
Well, yeah, I want to answer that. The Mills Act is an incentive. And here's why I believe in incentives for historic properties. And that is, there's an economic value to the owner of a property, of an historic property. They get to occupy it or rent it or sell it or whatever. There's an economic value for the owner. that owner's entitled to the economic value, but is also responsible for the economic cost. So that's where you own it, you got to put the cost in, but you get the benefit. But for historic properties, there's a whole range of values of those properties that don't accrue to the property owner. Environmental, cultural, aesthetic, attractiveness, educational. There's a whole range of kinds of values that those historic properties provide, but the property owner is not the beneficiary of that. The rest of us are. And so the policy justification for incentives like the Mills Act is the way that the rest of us contribute for the values we're receiving from that 1913 house. All the values aren't being accrued by the people who own it. The rest of us are getting values, and that's why it justifies incentive to keep it. And again, the Mills Act saying you got to keep it up, you got to maintain the character. But it really is saying, look, what the people can still have a roof over the head if the front porch is falling down. So they're not the beneficiary, that the rest of us are, and that's why the rest of us are warranted in supporting that kind of incentive.
It wasn't part of this study, but have you looked in other cities at the impact of preservation on neighborhood small businesses?
Yes, frequently. And what's really interesting is it's true in large cities and true in small cities. There's a geeky term in economic analysis called revealed preference. So here's how I'll explain it. If we had everybody on gallery on Zoom, and I asked the question, how many of you prefer chocolate ice cream? And a bunch of you would raise your hand. And then I'd say, how many prefer vanilla ice cream? And a bunch of others would raise their hand. That's stated preference. You raise your hand saying, I like chocolate better. The alternative is we could just, if we were all gathered together, we could wheel in a cart with ice cream cones, some vanilla, some chocolate, and you're going to take it. So you don't have to say, I like vanilla better. You took a vanilla cone. Well, that's the kind of what revealed preference is. So we have looked at the revealed preference of small businesses, of startup businesses, of women-owned businesses, of minority-owned businesses in New York, in Dallas, in Cumberland, Maryland, in Columbia, South Carolina. And there is and what you find is that, and this applies to commercial districts, of course, is that there is a disproportionate choice. In those, I'm a minority business owner, I'm a woman business owner, I'm a startup business owner, I can be wherever I want. There's a disproportionate choice, a revealed preference to be in those districts. So if the citywide share of businesses of new businesses is 5%, there's going to be 8% of those that 8% who choose to be in a historic district. The other thing that was true in St. Petersburg, Florida, is that there was a very long commercial district. It was not a historic district, but it was clearly of historic character and the favorite commercial street in the business. One side of the street was pretty well retained, and these were 1920s, 1930s, not unlike commercial districts in San Diego. The other side was seeing a lot of new development taking place at, of course, a larger scale. So we did survey block by block. Well, where the small businesses were, locally owned businesses, was disproportionately in those historic buildings across the street. That almost no locally owned businesses were in that new, 10-story condo building with retail on the ground floor, some bank chain or some bank retailer or chain retailer or something else. So yes, there's lots of evidence from lots of places about this disproportionate choice of small business, startup businesses, young businesses, minority-owned businesses, female-owned businesses, disproportionate choice of being in historic districts.
Given that historic districts cover less than 1% of the city's land area, what impact would weakening preservation protections realistically have on overall housing supply?
I'm going to turn it around. Look, sure, you need more density, you need more housing, if you're not smart enough to do it in 99% of the land area, maybe you're not smart enough to be a developer. It's just idiotic to say, let's weaken the historic preservation or laws when what we have this small area in population and in land area with this disproportionate carrying its share of housing, of diversity, of equity, of affordability, the whole range of things, it'd just be lunacy. It would be irresponsible lunacy to say, "Oh yeah, well we need to get rid of those historic things because they're stopping growth, they're stopping development, they're stopping affordability." Nonsense. Not that I feel strongly about that, but I just tell you.
Were any of the findings in San Diego surprising compared to other cities you've studied?
Uh, yeah, I think this issue of the relative affordability of historic districts was surprising. This extraordinary contribution of older housing was surprising. Also, candidly, the relatively few numbers of federal tax credit projects in San Diego surprised us. It wasn't part of the report, but we usually look at number of historic tax credit projects, and there's the Granger Hotel is a great one, Granger Building, but that was a surprising, frankly, disappointment. One of the disappointments that how little underutilized the federal tax credit is in San Diego.
What is the most common misconception about historic preservation that your research helps clarify?
Yeah, the historic preservation, those historic neighborhoods are nice, but they're for rich white people. And that just ain't so anyplace. Doesn't mean there's not historic neighborhoods that are full of rich white people, but it means that in the aggregate, that just simply is not the case.
How do tools like the Mills Act fit into the broader picture of housing stability and affordability?
Well, it's a critical cool tool. And again, as there's a question you said earlier. Look, if we didn't have that, we couldn't afford to stay here. We'd have to give it up. The house would go into disrepair. So I think it adds to affordability. It also adds to stability of the neighborhood. It adds to the character and the quality of the neighborhood. And again, 1,900 projects is not like the city of San Diego is going broke because of the Mills Act. It's just an effective tool that I would say the returns that the public gets for all of those non-economic values that maintaining historic properties generate far outweighs by an order of magnitude whatever economic cost of foregoing a little property tax
is. And we have a comment. A teacher from the New School of Architecture and Design says they use your economics book in their preservation class, and they just want to compliment you on the brilliant research. Even the students think so. And thank you for your dedication to scientifically quantifying the values of preservation.
Well, thanks. I'll send you your retainer check as soon as we're off here. So thanks very much.
All right. And it looks like that's it for the questions, and we're just about out of time, so that worked out well. All right.
Well, thank you all. You're doing a great job in preservation in San Diego, and it's a travesty that people are saying, "Oh, this historic district, it's too much. It ought to be expanded, not limited."
All right. I can see both of us. Hopefully, everybody else can too. And thank you, Donovan, for the insightful and thought-provoking presentation and for helping us see with such clarity the measurable value of preserving the places that define San Diego's character. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Your interest, your engagement, and your commitment to these conversations are what make this work possible. We encourage you to continue exploring San Diego Historic Preservation, a Vitality Report at sohosandiego.org to share its findings and to think about how you can be part of advancing this work, whether through advocacy, education, or simply by supporting the historic places in your own neighborhood. On behalf of everyone at SOHO, thank you again for being here. We hope you'll stay connected with us for future programs and initiatives. All right. Thank you, Donovan. We appreciate having you.
Thank you.
Everybody have a good rest of the weekend.